In this week's portion, it begins, and it was after the end of 2 years. Paro begins dreaming. Why at this moment? We'd read in the previous portion how Yosef was accused of attempting to rape his master's wife. He was falsely accused. He was put into a dungeon for 10 years. At the end of the 10-year period, and he was the personal valet. He was given the responsibility of the wine steward and the baker who were put into this. This was a prison for diplomats, for ministers. And they had a dream, and he interpreted their dreams. And the interpretation was accurate. And he had sent to the wine steward that the meaning of his dream was in 3 days you're going to be reinstated as the wine steward of the king. And I'm asking you a favor, to remember me and mention me. For those 2 words that he said, mention me, remember he mentioned me, which was considered a lack of faith, he spent another 2 years in the dungeon. So first he was meant to be released after 10 years, but because he had failed in faith in God, relying on this heathen, this Egyptian, that he would be the so-called, the key to his escape or to be released, that was a failing. So for the 2 words, he spent another 2 years. So in total, Yosef was 12 years in prison. Now, why was he in prison for the first 10 years? So, why did his master's wife have her eye on Yosef? Yosef was the most beautiful human being who ever was born into this existence, male human being. And he had special ability. He was given the full reign of his master's affairs, all his financial affairs. And he's starting to address his physical appearance. So God says to him, your father is grieving over you. Is this appropriate behavior? That you're addressing to portray your beauty, your good looks, it's inappropriate. And therefore he says, I will sick this woman on you. And this is when she tried to seduce him. It was disastrous. She did not succeed. And she accused him of trying to rape her. And he was thrown into this dungeon for 10 years. After 10 years, he's meant to be released again. Because he relied on this heathen to be released. And that's where he made the request. And he said 2 words. He spent 12 years. Two additional years in prison. Only when the 12-year period was up, Paro begins dreaming. And Paro needs a dream interpreter. And the wine steward initially, who had suppressed that request and intentionally forgot about it, now realizes he's going to be forced to share with the king that there was somebody who could interpret his dreams. That was Yosef. And this was his rise to power immediately. From the depths of the abyss of suffering to become the viceroy of Egypt. This is what happened. Relatively speaking, within moments. I mentioned in the past a principle which is stated by the Maral of Prague, phenomenal principle, phenomenal. We find that Moshe, when he was shepherding the sheep of his father-in-law in Midian, he sees something unusual. A bush is burning, and it's not consumed by the fire. Immediately, he hears an angel speaking to him. Remove your shoes. You're standing on hallowed ground. And he enters into a dialogue with God that he's meant to be the redeemer of the Jewish people. And God says to him, when you go, you'll perform revealed miracles to prove that you are my agent. And Moshe goes, and he performs the miracles. And the Torah tells us, in the presence of the elders of the Jewish people, it says, and the people believed. After he performed the miracles to prove that he was God's agent, it says the people believed that he was the Redeemer, that God had sent him to take them out of Egypt. The Jews, although they were pagans, they became pagans in Egypt due to the bondage. But they had known that there is a monotheistic being that's in their background. It's part of the family's religion. That was the Jews. The patriarchs, they introduced monotheism to the world. They, due to their predicament of being slaves, it was weakened. And they were involved in idolatry of Egypt. But the moment they hear that God sends his agent to take them out of Egypt, out of bondage, says they believed that there is a God and this is God's agent. It says, Vayaminhom, the people believed. The masses believed. So the Midrash says, when it says Vayaminhom, they believed, it says immediately the bondage ceased at that moment. The Jews were no longer subject to the physical bondage of Egypt. The masters could not enslave them anymore at that moment because they believed. So the Maharal of Prague goes to explain, what is believing in God? Why at that moment were they relieved of their physical duties as slaves? At that moment, they were no longer subject to the bondage. They couldn't enforce the bondage. Why? So the Maharal of Prague says something phenomenal. What is a slave? A slave is a person whose every aspect of his being is affected and dictated by the master. His physical actions, and ultimately even his mind, being continuously under the influence of the master. And you can't think for yourself because your time is bound to the will of the master. Eventually, even your thought process becomes impacted by the master's dictates. That's what a slave is. A slave is a person who's totally affected by an outside influence. That's what a slave is. External influence. What is the profile of physicality of the world? Everything is cause and effect. This cause and effect. We're exposed to certain environments. Those environments are the cause which brings about an effect, and we're affected by the environment. You have a fresh piece of bread. If it's exposed to the air and not preserved in a certain type of environment, what happens to that bread? Over time, it gets stale, and eventually it withers and turns back to dust. That's cause and effect. Physical existence is cause and effect. Whether it's seasons, whether it's people, whether it's environment, everything is affected. But that's within the physical realm. What about within the spiritual realm? Within the spiritual realm, whatever exists is a constant. Once it exists, it exists. It does not wither. Nothing could affect it to diminish it. You're not affected. One is something which has a spiritual profile is not affected by environment. That's an indication of being spiritual. If you live in a paganistic society, such as the Jews, they're slaves. And when Moshe comes, performs the miracles, they believe that there's a monotheistic being. What that belief is assuming a persona were unaffected. The Jews at that moment took on a position were unaffected. Because as an affected people, we should have fallen on deaf ears. There's no such thing as a monotheistic being because we're pagans. Because the prevalent belief of the Egyptian culture, there is no God. Everything is deities. But yet they believed at that moment that is what? There is a monotheistic being. Accepting that belief means they assumed a persona, a position, were not influenced. The moment you are not influenced, who are you? You function in what capacity? As a spiritual being. Spiritual means you're unaffected. What's slavery? The most extreme level of being affected. Therefore, when they assumed the position of being unaffected in terms of their belief, the bondage stopped immediately at that moment. Because bondage means extremely affected. They believed, despite the fact they were part of a paganistic society, and the masters were pagans, and the influencers were pagans. We believe they did not allow themselves to be affected. That itself is assuming a spiritual profile. Therefore, this person cannot be dominated because he behaves as an unaffected person. This is the morale of Prague, as I'm explaining it. Okay? We find at the end of the Torah, before Moshe passes away at the age of 120. And the Torah says, despite his advanced age, and he passed away at the day he was born, he was exactly 120 years old. It says, his vibrancy was not diminished despite his age. His physical ability was not diminished. His eyesight was not diminished. He was like a young man, although he's 120 years old. So the question is, the morale of Prague asks, what is the Torah giving us? A physical update on Moshe Rabbeinu. He's vibrant, he's powerful, he has keen eyesight. Why is this important for us to know? No, you get an update, Lahavdil, on the President of the United States, his personal physician. Not that you trust what he says, whether he has dementia, Alzheimer's, who knows what he has. No, the doctor tells you what he's told to tell you. But Lahavdil, Elif Abdolis, Moshe Rabbeinu, if the Torah is attesting to a physical state of being, what is the value of this? The morale of Prague explains, because what the Torah is telling us, as a physical being, there's an aging process. Because we're influenced and affected and impacted by our environment. We live as affected beings. Moshe Rabbeinu never lived as an affected being. He affected the others, but he was unaffected. As a result of that, he never aged. His power never waned. His vibrancy was always at its fullest capacity. His eyesight was perfect, like a young man. Because he lived a life of being unaffected, not allowing the influences of environment to affect him. Therefore, he lived as if he was in a spiritual realm of existence. So that's to attest to why Moshe Rabbeinu was Moshe Rabbeinu. Yosef was Yosef HaTzadik. He was a very spiritual person. He was the most special son of Yaakov. Yosef himself says in the Gemara, he was meant to father 12 children. As his father fathered 12 children, 12 tribes, he was meant to father 12 tribes. And his children would have been the tribes of Israel. As we find, Ephraim and Manasseh were grandchildren of Yaakov. And yet Yaakov designated these two grandchildren to have the exact same status as his own children. He says Ephraim and Manasseh are the equivalent of Reuven and Shimon. As Reuven and Shimon are two tribes of the tribes of Israel, Ephraim and Manasseh are two tribes of Israel. But how could it be? They're grandchildren. They're not the children of Yaakov. Since Yosef himself in his own dimension was similar to his father, therefore he was able to produce something his father would have produced. Therefore, he was meant to have 12 children. So why did he only have two, not 10? So the Gemara explains that when he was seduced, nearly seduced by this Egyptian woman, by the mistress, he was overwhelmed with desire and he was able to suppress, and he did not, God forbid, commit adultery with her. But in that overwhelmed state of desire, he lost 10 droplets of semen. But I'm telling you now, the Gemara, this is the Gemara. For every droplet of semen that he lost the tribe. Each droplet was meant to be a tribe, one of the tribes that he would have fathered. But because he succumbed to temptation to be aroused to that degree, for every droplet of semen, he lost the tribe. Okay, let's talk. He flees from her. He does not commit adultery. He's accused that he raped her. What happens? His master had a prison for what? For white-collar crime, for this kind of things, for ministers, for diplomats. Yosef was put into that prison. What's prison? Prison is incarceration. Prison is limitation. Prison is you've lost freedom of your own control. But why? And 10 years he was condemned. 10 years in the dungeon. Because to what degree was Yosef affected by the advancement of his mistress? He lost 10 droplets of semen. That was the degree that he was affected. So to the degree they affected, what does that mean? You're subject to what? To prison. Because you no longer, you've diminished your spiritual persona by allowing yourself to be affected. Once you allow yourself to be affected, you're treated like an affected person. 10 years in prison. What happens after 10 years? Yosef interprets a dream, and he's in a state of desperation. He wants out. It's 10 years. And he goes and seeks out the assistance of the wine steward. And he says 2 words. Remember me, mention me. To what degree was he affected by his state of desperation? 2 words. For every word that he had said, that was an indication that he was affected. To what degree? 2 words. For each word, it's a year. Another additional 2 years of prison. Because now being in prison, you're totally affected. That's how we come to the number of 12. 10 and an additional 2, which is 12. That's what it's all about. So let's talk now what's relevant to us. And this is a continuation of the previous discussion. The Ramchal writes, Rabbi Luzzatto writes, what is the value of evil? God created. There's an evil. We're talking about the evil inclination. And there's evil. What is the value of evil? The human being was created to have choice. And because every person has choice, whether you're a Jew or non-Jew, if you do the right thing, why did you do the right thing? It was due to your own initiative. And why did you fail? Because you chose to fail. Therefore, you're fully deserving if you make the right choice, and you have full level of liability, God forbid, if you make the wrong choice. Because we're always standing at a crossroads. It's up to us to make that choice. That's what it's about. So but if there would not be evil, if you would not have the alternative to good, would you be in a context of making choices? No. So what's the value of evil? What I'm saying now is very profound. It's the Ramchal, Rabbi Luzzatto. The value of evil is not to do evil. Instead, not to do evil. To succumb to evil means you failed. To not to do evil and choose the right thing to do, then you've succeeded. Evil is, what is physicality? What is temptation? What is inclination? From where does that draw to evil come from? From our physicality. So naturally, we gravitate towards that. What about a person goes against the grain? and we suppress it. And despite the overwhelming desire, inclination to go south, we go north, and we make the right choice. What is that right choice? That right choice is acting in a context, I will be unaffected. I'm unaffected as a physical being. But living a life where you're unaffected, what is that a characteristic of? Physicality, spirituality. That itself is the persona of a spiritual person. To live a life, despite I am influenced or I'm being attempted to be influenced, I don't succumb to that influence. I rein in on myself and I go against the grain. Whenever you go against the grain, that's not a physical characteristic. That's a spiritual characteristic. Because doing the wrong thing is a diminishment. And naturally, that's where you should go. I chose to go against it, contrary to it, to be unaffected. Unaffected is a spiritual characteristic. So what is the end result of doing the right thing? You become spiritualized. That's why whenever every mitzvah we do, we're actually spiritualizing our physicality. We're spiritualizing our mind. We're spiritualizing our inclination. That's mitzvah gores mitzvah. You do a mitzvah, it engenders more mitzvah for that reason. Because the closer you get to spiritual, and the more spiritual you are, you have a greater potential in the spiritual realm than if you would have made the mistake to go and succumb to that physical desire and temptation for that reason. So Yosef is now in prison for 10 years, and additional 12. When the buzzer goes off after 12 years, Paro begins dreaming immediately. And he has dreams which all the dream interpreters of Egypt, the greatest experts, they're offering interpretations, but Paro is not satisfied. Till finally the wine steward pipes up and he says, there was an unstable person in prison with us. He's an alien, he's a foreigner. He's a slave. And he tells over the story that he and the baker had dreams, and he gave an accurate reading on what the dream was. He has that ability. Immediately he's summoned from the dungeon, and Paro presents his dream, and sure enough, it's the right interpretation. Paro's very satisfied. That's what happens. But why did Paro start dreaming only after 12 years? Because that's his ticket to freedom. He could have left 2 years earlier. He didn't have to leave 2 years later. But because he failed and he was behaved like an affected person, he succumbed to desperation. Therefore, the dream of Paro was delayed 2 years. He dreams, he needs interpretation. Yosef presents himself, is put on the scene. Yosef will interpret the dreams, and he does. And Paro was so overwhelmingly impressed with Yosef. He says, have you ever seen a mortal who's so divinely inspired? This is not human genius, this is divine genius. Goes beyond. And a person like Paro, who was the monarch of the most advanced civilization, when he saw something special, he appreciated and recognized that. This is Paro speaking. Have we seen ever someone with Ruach Elokimbo? He has the spirit of God within himself. It's like God speaks through him. He's a conduit for God's word. Now, the wine steward, when finally he shares with Paro that Yosef was an unstable person, he is an alien, a foreigner, and he's a slave. Why does he depict him with all these various levels of identification? For what reason? So the Midrash tells us that the wine steward, when he says nar, he's unstable. He's a foreigner. He's a slave. The wine steward realized, he spent a year with Yosef in prison, that this man has exceptional capability. And if he's released from prison, he understands where he's going. He's going straight to the top. Yosef, in his background, he was a prisoner. Yet the Torah tells us last week's reading that he was the equivalent of the warden. He ran the prison. Wherever Yosef goes, there's nothing less than way to the top. Before he was accused of trying to rape his mistress, it says he oversaw all the financial affairs of his master. The master had no idea what was going on. He was fully entrusted. Yosef has the capacity. He goes straight to the top, the most advanced leadership position. The Sarah Mashkim understood if Yosef is released, he's going straight to the top. At this moment, Yosef is rotting in the dungeon for an additional 2 years. So he figures he has to divulge that he has the ability to interpret dreams. But we all know that first impressions make the greatest impression. And if he depicts him as unstable, he depicts him as a foreigner. A foreigner, it's the protocols of Egypt. A foreigner cannot become a minister in the Egyptian court because he's a foreigner. And if he's a slave, anybody who's a slave in his background does not qualify to be part of the royal family. Does not. So the wine steward is trying to cut him off at every pass. That he doesn't have a chance to rise, to be able to be recognized, appreciated for his ability as this one of a kind of human being. And we find that the Sarah Mashkim, the wine steward, is faulted for this. And Rashi cites the Midrash. The Midrash says it slightly differently. Cursed are the evil, that even when they try to do the right thing, they can't do it right. You're already divulging there's a person who has this capacity. Just started with that, ended with that. What do you have to depict him as? A slave, unstable? He doesn't speak our language. What's the value of all that? The answer is because the Sarah Mashkim did not want him to rise to power. And therefore, it's an indication, cursed are the evil, that the evil themselves, even when they do the right thing, they can't do it fully good in a right manner. It's tinged and tainted with all this kind of negativity. So I ask the question. You understand? The wine steward is late to the game here. Yosef, he understands Yosef's capacity. He's rising to power. Probably the viceroy. If this person becomes the viceroy, and he attributes his additional 2 years in prison because the Sarah Mashkim, the wine steward, did not share what he should have shared 2 years earlier. So all the suffering of Yosef is attributed to the Sarah Mashkim, to the wine steward. If that's the case, what level of revenge will Yosef take if he becomes the viceroy of Egypt? The wine steward's life is worthless. So what is he doing? This is purely for the sake of self-preservation. By trying to depict Yosef in the most pejorative way, in the most deprecating level, it's only to put a damper, to clip his wings, that he can't be in a position to actually take revenge. Every human being would do what he did, because factually he failed. He should have mentioned immediately, and he did not. So how could we say the takeaway from this is, cursed are the evil, even when they do the right thing, they can't do it completely. It's all tainted with all this other stuff, as they say, surrounding Yosef, depicting him in the most deprecating way. So that's my question. Why is that a takeaway where this is purely for the sake of self-preservation? I'll give you an example. A person has a financial payment to make to the bank, mortgage payment, and he's already late. And the bank told him that if he doesn't make this mortgage payment, he'll be dispossessed from his house. We put it on the street. And he goes to a person who has the means and has the ability to help him as a loan, not as a gift. The man says, I'm not interested in helping you. Due to this man withholding the favor, he's put out on the street, he loses his home. Due to this, he can't put food on the table. Due to this, one of his children gets sick and dies. Okay? Fast forward, the man eventually recovers from his financial problems and he's in a position of power. The man who originally turned him down on the loan, we reverse the roles. He becomes impoverished and he needs the favor. And he goes to the one who originally was denied the favor. He says, by the way, could you help me out? The man says, help you out? After what I've gone through because of you, where do you even have the audacity to come to me to help you out? And it's a natural reaction. The wine steward understands. If Yosef reaches and understands who Yosef reaches the level of viceroy, his life is worthless. His family's life is worthless. He will take revenge with a passion against him. So he's doing whatever he can to protect his flank. So why is the takeaway from here is, Arur Shoim, cursed are the evil, because even when they do the right thing, they can't do it right. He did the right thing. This is purely self-preservation. But yet he's faulted. The Saramashkim for articulating it and depicting him in this most negative light. How do you understand it simply? So what we said in the past was, the truth is, did Yosef have any negative feeling towards the wine steward because he did not mention him or remember him? The answer is no. Yosef understood the reason why he stayed another 2 years in prison was because he failed. Then why he asked the wine steward, but God says, no, he will not remember you. You're barking up the wrong tree. As a result of your lack of faith, you're going to spend another 2 years in prison. Yosef is not, because he's a tzaddik, he sees it correctly. He attributes the shortcoming, the failing to himself. It has nothing to do with the wine steward. If that's the case, when he becomes viceroy, he has no reason to take revenge against the wine steward, because the wine steward has nothing to do with his plight. This level of suffering in the dungeon for initial 2 years is all because he failed. So okay. So if the wine steward would have seen through the same lens as Yosef saw it, would he have reason to depict Yosef in this pejorative, negative way? The answer is no. It's only because he was seeing through the lens of an evil person. All evil people, what do they believe? That they dictate their lives. They determine their lives. It's the power of my hand brought about all my success. As a result of that, he's processing Yosef in his context. If that's the case, you got to protect yourself. You got to protect your flank. Because I know what I would do. So if I know what I would do, that's probably what Yosef's can do. Don't you realize your world's apart? Yosef is tzaddik. Everything he attributes to God has nothing to do with you. But because with being a Rishoyim, we don't only mean the wine steward, every evil person, because of his perspective and reality of life, that everything is determined by man's behavior and man's own initiative. Therefore, that's the reason why he painted this ugly picture of Yosef to protect himself. But it was baseless. He had no reason to. Story I just heard yesterday. This person was right towards the end of the war. And there's a holy Hasidic rabbi, and he was named Rab Arla Belza. He was the Belza holy rabbi, head of the Belz dynasty. And it was known he was divinely inspired. He would advise people, and if he gave a blessing, the blessing actually took effect. So this person was escaping Europe, and he was a diamond merchant, and he had gold and diamonds, and he was concerned, and he has to cross borders. When he comes to the border crossing, the gold that he has, which is the only asset that he has that he could protect his life and save his life and maybe reestablish himself in the future, as if he's in possession of the gold and the diamonds. So he asked the Arla Belza, the Belza Rav, Rebbe, holy rabbi.
Hi, how are you?
For advice.
You don't have a pen with you, do you?
For advice, what should he do? He says, I give you advice. If you make a commitment not to speak falsehoods, not to lie, from now going forward, everything you have will remain with you. It will not be taken from you. Okay? But if you compromise your integrity, then you're going to be subject to many bad things. So the blessing is the contingent on being honest. So he's traveling, he finally comes to a border, and the border guard says to him, are you carrying any gold or diamonds? So he realizes if he doesn't say the truth, he's going to lose it. And if he says the truth, he's also going to lose it. But he says, so what does he have to lose? He says to the border guard, I have gold and I have diamonds. You hear this? The border guard says, if that's the case, just go through. Because he said the truth, the border guard couldn't believe that he was saying the truth. Just to the contrary. If he would have said, I don't, he'd be suspect. Maybe he does. But because he says, I do have it, he took it. Which person in his right mind would say he's carrying that level of valuables if he knows it's going to be taken away? Evidently, he doesn't have it, and therefore we let him through. You understand? But the reason why the border guard processed that way is because he maintained his level of integrity, of purity, that he would not lie. So the merit of not lying, that's why it was not taken away. In the merit of faith, I will get out of this prison. But because you failed on the faith level, because you chose to rely on this heathen, to take the initiative in your own hands, that's why he spent another 2 years in prison. That's Yosef's lens. The evil man's lens, which is the wine steward, that's not his lens. His lens is everything is determined how you choose. You have to do your best. Even if you have to step on people, even if you have to abuse people, because that's what life's all about. As they used to say, it's a dog-eat-dog world. It's survival of the fittest. If you live as a person who's everything, you're a predator, as you're the predator, you could become the victim of another predator. But if you live a life where it's all God, then you're not going to be a victim. And if you are a victim, that's God's doing. It has nothing to do with the one who victimizes you. Because he chose that you should be victimized, God forbid. That's what it's about. So Arura is showing, cursed are the evil, not only the wine steward. This is the lens of all evil people. They process life as they believe life is, without God part of the equation. But Yosef, that's not the way he processes. He processes it, it's all God's doing. That I'm here an additional 2 years is unrelated to the wine steward. And because I failed, therefore I'm here for another 2 years. Okay? Wine steward has no choice. Yosef's released. And Paro says to Yosef, I hear that you have the ability to interpret dreams. Yosef knew exactly how he'd be depicted by the wine steward in the most pejorative, denigrating, deprecating way. So what does he say? He says, I have no ability whatsoever. God will respond and bring peace to Paro. It's God. I'm only a conduit for God's word. I mean, here he depicts him as unstable, not fit to reign because he's a slave, doesn't speak the language. And yet, meaning, and we know first impressions are the greatest impression. So if Yosef wouldn't have said, God will respond, it's not me, well, how would he be seen? He'd be a savant. Savant. In one tiny area, it's beyond genius. The rest, totally shut down. He says, no, it's not me. I don't have the ability to interpret dreams. It's God. That's what it's all about. Because he understood and knew exactly how he'd be depicted. Because that's the way an evil person's, that's the way his lens processes things. Therefore, he responded to deflect that has no relevance to him. The power should see him for his true value. And he did. And only because of that, he rose to this powerful position of the most powerful person in the world. To be Yosef is the sustainer of existence due to his interpreting of the dream. He said, one of the things he says he's Ivri. He doesn't speak our language. The Talmud tells us, it's a question when it happened, but by the night before he was released from prison, Gabriel, the archangel, was sent, paid him a visit in prison. I'm not sure if it was during visiting hours or not, but he paid him a visit. And during this period of time, he taught him 70 languages. When Yosef was released from prison and stood before Paro, he spoke 71 languages. 70 languages correspond to the root nations of the world. In addition, he spoke Hebrew. We're talking about here, he depicts him as a person who doesn't speak our language. And this man is the master of languages, besides the level of genius that he displayed and everything else. So immediately, the moment he opened his mouth, he refuted everything the wine steward had said, the picture the wine steward had painted. I'll give you an example. You have a person attractive, beautiful, physically beautiful. And somebody says, the one who's going to walk through the door, you would never see such an ugly person in your life. And the person walks in, radiates a level of beauty and handsomeness never to be seen before. So what does the person say? By the way, where's that ugly person that you spoke about? Never came through the door. He depicts Yosef and this most unstable, incapable, limited person. And all of a sudden, the man, when he comes, who stands before him, he's the equivalent of the king plus. Something's wrong. The depiction of the wine steward immediately is obliterated. Yosef's seen totally different. Being seen in this new role, in this new ability, this new capacity, this is the material for Viceroy. And he chose him, he appointed to be Viceroy. Did Yosef take revenge against the wine steward? Definitely not. It's not going to waste his time with him. It had nothing to do with the wine steward. It had to do with what? With God himself, because he failed. He's not looking for scapegoats to assume responsibility for his own misbehavior. That's the difference between a tzaddik and not a tzaddik. A tzaddik understands everything is determined based on his own personal record. A person not a tzaddik, he believes he's perfect. Therefore, whenever a problem arises, he's always looking for a scapegoat to blame someone else for his misfortune. That's the way it goes. Share with you a story. There was a famous person, his name was Count Prince Patutsky. Prince Petoskey lived in time of the Vilna Gaon. He was the son of the king of Poland. He was the heir to inherit all Poland with its wealth, all the land, everything. And when his father was alive, he went and he converted to become a Jew. And he became a devout Jew. And in the 18th century, if a Christian became a Jew, it was punishable by death. This is what happened. So what happens? And word got back to the Franciscan order, which was the most rabid order of Christians, of Christianity. They were hunting for him. And if they would find him, they would burn him at the stake. This is the Prince of Poland. And his father passed away in the interim. And he's hiding in some village. He looked wearing the garb of a Jew, and he is a Jew with a beard. And somehow somebody informed where he was. He's taken, and they bring him before the tribunal of the church, and they say, and they give him a choice. They said, normally a person converts to be Jew, he's not given a second chance. He's put to death. He's burnt at the stake. But you, because you're the king of Poland now, if you make a public retraction and openly condemn Judaism and declare Christianity to be the true religion, then we allow you to assume the throne of Poland. Otherwise, we're going to burn you at the stake. He says, I will burn at the stake. I will not denounce Judaism. I will die as a Jew. There's a story. I'm not in any way exaggerating any point. What happens? The Vilna Gaon had told him that through a Kabbalistic incantation, he could save his life and prevent him from being burnt at the stake. He says, no, I want to die as a Jew and sanctify God's name. That's what I want, because that is the right thing to do. And they set the fire. They built this bar of wood, and they have him bound, hand and foot, and they ignite it. The Franciscan monks who are around there, they're getting worried. They see he's really a holy man. And they feel that when he goes to heaven and he comes before the heavenly throne, he's going to go and inform on them as if that, and he's going to prosecute all these people, and they're worried. So they say to him, you realize we're only doing because we believe in this. But have mercy on us. Yeah, that's them murdering him, burning him at the stake, and they're asking mercy from this convert that when he comes before the heavenly throne, he shouldn't speak too harshly about them, where they're taking his life. So he said to them, I want to explain to you what it's all about. There were these young boys who were friends with the prince when he was a little boy, and they would play to him. And when they were young, they took him, the prince, and they beat him up and they threw him into mud. And then they ran off. Fast forward 40 years later, now the prince is the king. And they heard the king is coming to their community. And they're terrified. Because if the king remembers what they did to him as little boy, how they beat him up and threw him in the mud, he can immediately have him arrested and put to death. So what do? They preempt the king. They come before the king, they throw themselves at his feet, and they plead and beg for mercy that they should live. He doesn't know what's going on, the king. So what's this all about? So he tell him a story when they were children, how they had beaten him up and threw him in the mud. So he said to them, don't you think I have more important things to think about? We were children, and it's all meaningless. Just don't waste my time. Just go do your own thing. So the convert says, when I ascend to heaven, I'm going to have more important things to talk about. I'm going to be preoccupied with more important things than talking about you. What happens to you, that's up to God, what he wants to do with you people. But I know where I'm going. And where I'm going, I'm going to be very fully invested up there. Therefore, you're totally irrelevant to me. That's the story. Yosef, being the tzaddik, he understood exactly why his predicament was what it was, why he spent another 2 years to suffer in prison, because he failed by acting in desperation, relying on this heathen. Therefore, he has nobody to blame but himself. But the evil, where they see themselves perfect, so whenever there's any slight tilt, they're always looking for somebody else. Why was there that tilt? Why was there this reversal? It's not me. I'm too worthy for it. Must be somebody else. Therefore, the wine steward behaved as he behaved, and Yosef behaved as he did, never even attempting to take revenge because it was unrelated to the wine steward's misbehavior.